Hi, everyone. Today, me and Wren are going to be talking about how Tolkien influenced their graphic novel, The House on Caple Hill. So, our first question for this session is: will your graphic novel, The House on Caple Hill, have a lot of world building, even though it is a more character driven work? What role will world building play in The House on Caple Hill?
Hi, Fortunist Games. It's great to be back. Um, as far as world building in the House on Caple Hill, it's really going to play a huge role in this work because although it is a character-driven work, it takes place over a number of parallel universes and parallel timelines. So I really have to take a look at each one and determine, what place in history does this kind of fit in, and if events in the real world went a little differently than they did, what would that, what echoes or waves could we expect back from those pebbles being dropped in the pool, as it were?
Right. That's actually a very common theme we see in a lot of sci-fi, especially stuff with, time loops and alternative realities.
Absolutely. I think it's a very common trope, if you will, in science fiction and fantasy that deals with any kind of parallel universes, that there are points in history that diverge, where if another outcome had been the conclusion of an event, then history could have been very different. And exploring those themes is what makes up a lot of the bulk of those works.
Absolutely. So I think, as we talked about on the Instagram Live, there is one story in particular in The House on Capel Hill that is the most obviously influenced by Tolkien because it takes place in a medieval setting.
I suppose you could say that. I hadn't really thought of it that way initially, but the more I think about the way Tolkien has influenced me as a writer, and the more I think about Rowan's story in particular, the more I see that it could be very Tolkien-esque. It's the story of a fae who goes out in search of a way to find. He goes out to search for a way to save his people, to save the fae that are left in the world, as humanity is becoming more quote unquote intellectual, or knows better than to believe in things like fairies or magic or that sort of thing. But it's also a very interesting time that it'll take place in, where it is pretty medieval. We're going to be looking at like the about the 14th to the 16th centuries, when men of magic and men of science were almost synonymous, but there was still a huge fear of things like witchcraft, or things like people were very much afraid of fae and brownies and that kind of thing. But there were also huge waves of it almost seemed like, even in the wake of these tremendous wars like the 100 Years' War, when people were looking for meaning and people were looking for something to believe in, there came almost another war, a cultural war of, you might almost call it religion versus spirituality, where you had an edifice like the church, the Christian church, at odds against any spiritualism that was in opposition of it, or even just was different from it.
That's very true. Because
Yes,
this was before the Protestant Reformation. So it was, the time of the Holy Roman Church.
exactly. It was the time of events like the Moors being driven from Spain. It was a time for things like the why am I losing my words today? The Crusades. It was a time when there was still so much about the world that people didn't understand. And in searching for ways to explain those things, you either veered towards a tradition that seemed to be growing and encompassing the world, or you stayed to belief systems and spirituality that was more centered towards what was local to you, the local deities that your people had believed in before, and that kind of thing. And almost like a mirror, of the Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire sought to conquer the world with a cross. And
Mm-hmm.
as as noble as they would, try to justify their intentions as having been, what it amounted to was the destruction of other cultures.
Absolutely. And what culture is Rowan from? I know he is a Fae, so does it mean he is from the British Isles?
He is. A number of, I think almost all of my characters really are from the British Isles, and we'll see their connections to Germanic lore, and we'll see their connections to Egyptian lore in other episodes. More specifically, like I knew I needed to wait to tie in Egyptian mythology into this work because I was using their system of their look at the soul, the 9 pieces.
Mm-hmm.
And there is a legend that the peoples of Ireland, and more specifically Scotland, I believe, are descended from Egyptian royalty who traveled north. So I wanted to take a look at that also, and and see like, oh well, if the Egyptians made it that far north and things had gone a little differently, would we see a much more Egyptian looking culture in Britain and that kind of thing? But in Rowan's case in particular, yes, he is from the British Isles.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't specify a country that he's supposed to be from. He's just the spirit of a mountain spring. He's somewhere tucked away, and he's been sort of separated from the rest of the world for a very long time, until it starts in a very almost last unicorn way. It starts becoming very noticeable that the other spirits he knew and the other deities that have been there for so long start disappearing. And so he has to venture away from that isolation and seek a different path. And kind of the hinge of this story is that his name is not actually Rowan. It's another name that's only seen written in Ogham script, which is an ancient Celtic script.
Mm-hmm.
So there's definitely a theme of balancing your true identity with the one that keeps you safe. There are definitely themes of putting yourself in a place of vulnerability, not for your own sake, but for the sake of others. And I'm really excited to be working on his part of the story.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And Rowan's journey also mirrors what happens at the end of the house on Caple Hill, correct? Because I remember that Josephine's own true name is also an Ogham script.
It's the same one because Rowan is her Wren.
Mm-hmm.
He is her name.
Right.
He's just a personification of her true name. So there is a bit of that, and part of the I don't know, I guess the resolution of the story is that, after these hundreds of years traveling the world and making safe havens for other Fae, along his travels, he kind of starts to have that fraud disorder where people kind of start to question, like, is this really who I am? Was I ever really a Fae? Was any of that real? But it takes an intervention from Josephine to remind him who he really is and the power of his real name. And that's kind of what gives us the resolution of the story.
Absolutely. So Rowan's story is at the end of the series, correct? Because as I remember from our previous podcast about the different parts of the soul, I think the one about Wren is closer to the end.
It is closer to the end, yes. I think it's going to be in the final 3. I think I'm going to try and break it into a triplicate of triplicates and have, the first 3 kind of being the closest things for us as people in a Western society to understand things like the body and the life spark, and kind of moving on as we go through the series into the more, for lack of a better word, foreign concepts, abstract concepts of what makes up a person. And the final 3 will include the Wren and the Sahu, which is the heart of a personality, what you are when you boil away everything else. So yes, I think that's part of building up that tension so that the resolution is that much more satisfying, is having the most elusive and mysterious pieces of the soul being towards the end.
I agree. That's a good structure. So number two, which culture, i.e. Elvish or Dwarven, in Tolkien's work was the most inspirational for you?
Um, I think, that's a really difficult question, because I feel like there are two that definitely influence me as an author and as a storyteller and builder of worlds. And those would be the Elvish culture and the Hobbit culture, which are really the opposite, because the elves are the most ancient. Some of them, like Elrond and Galadriel, remember the days of, the days when Sauron was a full power. They remember things that men have forgotten, that dwarves have already forgotten. So there's this sense of an unknowable ancientness that they just encapsulate. And I think Tolkien really, he really nailed that when he decided to base their language off of Welsh, which is the oldest surviving Celtic language. And you can hear it when you hear Elvish, and you can hear it when when you hear the comparison of Elvish and Welsh. You can absolutely hear the similarities and the grammatical structure and such. Whereas on the complete flip side of that coin is the Hobbit culture, which I was recently telling a friend seems the most incongruous in the world of Middle Earth, because they're so modern. They're just about regency. They have waistcoats and things. They have such a modern, such an idyllic and privileged life, and they are so completely unaware and oblivious of all these things that happened so many thousands of years before they were ever even born. But I think that also gives the hobbits a really beautiful approach and perspective to the rest of their world, that they have a sense of childlike wonder that comes with the youth of a culture.
That's a good point. So they're pretty much polar opposites in many ways.
Exactly.
Is Rowan as a Fae more influenced by Elvish culture, I think, because he's more ancient?
Yes, he definitely is. He is, and part of the core of him as a character is this balladeer, a storyteller in and of himself, who keeps these oral traditions and histories of other cultures and other peoples alive. That he's going out on this journey not only to save the Fae that are still there, but to preserve their memory, and that's a huge part of his story. So I would say that he's definitely more influenced by by the Elvish culture, in the sense that he taps into those deep rememberings, and he does it out of a sense of respect and preservation, not out of a sense of never out of a this very colonialist sense of, well, I'm better than this culture anyway, but out of mercy I'll keep it alive. It's never that. It's always a point of well, this culture has its own life and it deserves its own dignity and respect, just as much as any other does.
Absolutely. And would you say that Josephine, and because of the whole Regency influence, is a little bit like the Hobbits, because before she sets out on her journey, she's also kind of privileged and a little bit encapsulated in her own society?
I'd say that is a very apt encapsulation of that thought. Josephine comes from a time, and it's interesting because there are many points in history when humanity has felt like, we have reached our peak. And I think the Victorians were one of those. They definitely thought they had reached their peak. Let's close the patent offices. What else is there there's nothing more to improve. But Josephine always comes from a place of questioning that. And I think that's a perspective that I hope to bring out in her throughout the series, is that she approaches, as she stumbles into these worlds, she's filled with wonder. It's not it doesn't have to be dread. It's not always dread. There's curiosity, um, there's being swallowed up in something more beautiful than you could have imagined from the time and the culture that you come from, and the joy of exploring those cultures and those ideologies.
Mhm. Absolutely. Finally, another main question we have, and after that we can ask smaller questions if needed. Did Tolkien's writing style have an impact on how you'll be writing your graphic novel? How about the framing of events and pacing?
That is such an interesting question because I feel like Tolkien's writing style can almost be different from book to book. As we talked about with Helleborn, like the difference between the tone of and the pacing of The Hobbit versus the pacing and tone of Lord of the Rings or of Silmarillion, like they have very different moods. And one thing that definitely influenced me about his style was that he was eloquent, but still he could still sound friendly, particularly in books like The Hobbit or Roverandom. You could still imagine knowing the narrator of these stories, and that was something that I always craved as an author, was to have that casual familiarity with my audience. That definitely impacted me, and again, the Hobbit's sense of wonder that comes with exploring and discovering something that's been, it's existed and it's been around so long that it's already been buried and has to be unearthed again. The wonder that comes out of unearthing something that ancient is definitely an influence that came to me from Tolkien.
Mhm. So will your graphic novel be in first person perspective or third person perspective?
Ah, that's a little funny. That's a little difficult because comics can kind of switch between in pretty smooth ways. If you look at works like, Sandman or something, it goes from between a third person narrator narrating the events of the Sandman's adventures to um it being, one of the characters themselves. And that's part of the idea that I'm going for, that there is an overarching third person narrative, but within each one of the 9 books, that perspective can vary. Some of them will be from the first person, some of them will be from the third, some of them will be a mixture. There's going to be a little bit of everything, just depending on what that character has to communicate, and how I want the audience to experience that.
Mhm. That makes sense, given that there are so many different characters and aspects to be explored, that there would be, a corresponding difference in narration style and perspective.
Yeah, I think so. And I never wanted this work to come across to other people in the way that some series do, where it's just kind of like, oh, I see, we're going back to the same character and we're just starting over. And that can be very wearing to me as a reader as well as a storyteller.
Mhm.
To and I understand the sense of grounding your audience with something familiar. However, I think that playing with how and when you ground them is pivotal to how the story lands. Because you might, we're going to go through Josephine's story in the first book, all of it, her whole life leading up to when she is first thrown into the crossroads. And as we see her enter and exit the other characters' lives, she is a grounding force, yes, because she is the most familiar. She's the most familiar in the sense that she's the character we've spent the most time with, and she's also the most familiar in the sense that we all know what a body is. We all know how a body feels. But we get to see her in relation to others in a different way. And when we decide to plop her, if you will, into the story and make the changes we need to make. We do see from her perspective that these are kind of leaps and bounds, but from the third party overarching perspective, we do also see the context of each of these characters' lives, not just Josephine's when she drops into their life, you know.
Right, exactly. That makes a lot of sense. Were there any other influences by Tolkien that influenced, your ideas for the house in Caple Hill?
I mean, certainly the Tolkien, I think Tolkien as an author almost influenced me more than any one of his works did, in the sense that he's this very intellectual, very scholastic sort of author, that he approaches each of his works, even if they do come out to be a little more casual, he approaches each of them with a very personal connection. He enters it with the knowledge of the cultures that he's kind of warped to make his own world, but it's very obvious that he's deeply rooted in these worlds himself, that he knows their mythology, he knows their histories, he knows, there's so much going into that we might not even touch on as a reader, but it carries across that it's still there.
And you aim to have that same kind of depth in your work, correct?
I absolutely do, yes. And it is a monumental task.
Yeah, it is.
There's so much research that goes into that, into so many different cultures and so many different histories, and they almost start to feel like parallels of themselves, like I listen to histories of Britain and Wales in particular, and you'll start with what archaeology can tell us about prehistory, and then you move on to sort of the great empires of antiquity and how those stretched and squashed and spread across the globe. And you start to wonder to yourself as you go through these histories, well, what would it have been like if the tables were turned, or if the empire, quote unquote, had been a whole different culture? Even going down as far as one, you might call it an Easter egg, I guess. One of the little details that I plan on having in my book is that when we touch on what in our world would be the Roman Empire, it's going to be called the Reman Empire, because it was named after Remus instead of Romulus. Like, even that small of a change in history, in mythology, how substantially do those snowball? How substantially do those exponentially develop over the course of a culture?
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. Right. So is there anything else you want to mention in this podcast about Tolkien's influence, or do you think we can talk about that in another podcast?
That's a really tough question, because then I scour my brain and I say, what else did Tolkien teach me? I think we could probably save some of that for the next time Helleborn joins us both, and we can kind of compare notes and see what thoughts she might have. I had just such immense fun talking with the three of you, and this has been such a wonderful experience coming on and being able to expand this discussion to the place it's gone is very gratifying.
We can also talk about individual stories, because I think Helleborn said she was considering reviewing, separate stories by Tolkien and how they influenced her.
Absolutely. I actually recently purchased the Silmarillion for my Kindle so that I could get started on that, because I feel like it's kind of been left out of my experience of Tolkien. Like, I understand what it is and how it fits into the mythos of Middle Earth, but I've always wanted to read it because, it's interesting because I also have this complaint with Game of Thrones that I'm almost more interested in the culture and the mythology of that world than I am in the story that's being told. Like, yeah, tell me about the 7 gods and their 7 heavens and hells. That sounds interesting more than Jon Snow or Daenerys, like that's that's just where I come. And I think that that might be partially that academic approach to fiction that rubbed off on me.
Oh, I have an idea. Next time we have a three-way with Haliborn, we could talk about how to do academic research. I think that would be a very interesting podcast. I know Tete would really like it because, she's also doing a lot of research for her story about Cossacks, Andre in the 20th century. So we can, especially since Haliborn has experience as a PhD in medieval history, she can really talk about how to do research, how to save time and energy, because it is a very arduous task. So I think she, and also myself, because I have taken a history major, even though I haven't gone on to do a master's or PhD in history. Sure. I can also share my experience in university about how to do research in a way that really minimizes energy, and it doesn't feel as much of an arduous task if you follow these steps.
Just a little less Sisyphus-y, and I would absolutely love that. Yeah. I did definitely learn some methods of academic research when I was in school, but to hear it from the perspectives of not only people who have the degrees, which is a lot more than I have, but also who have the experience doing the research and trying to figure out, well, what shortcuts can I take? How do I streamline this effort? I would absolutely love to hear that from y'all.
Right, exactly. Because I've been sharing a little bit with Tete recently, and we've been talking about how to use stuff like JSTOR and, how to use secondary versus primary sources to start out, and which sources are more reliable versus not. So those are some starting points we could talk about, with Haliborn, I think.
Yeah. Oh, although now that the thought finally crossed my mind, I think one other thing I wanted to blurb about Tolkien was the Mabinogion, which is a Welsh compendium of mythology from their culture in Britain, and that has been the basis for most of, I would say, basically all of what we call Western, high fantasy literature, and our concept of, knights on horses and dragons. And I believe Arthur also fits into there somewhere, but that kind of mythos all came from the Mabinogion, which Tolkien was very much a fan of, and which I plan on reading a little more in depth as things go on.
Right. Haliborn is actually in Cambridge right now. So, she did do an Instagram live a few hours ago. So I hope she can share more things, and maybe that could also be of inspiration to all of us.
Oh, that would be lovely.
Yeah. I wonder if, I don't think she would come across anything Welsh, because that's in a different place in the UK, right?
In Cambridge, they probably would, actually, because Welsh mythology, including things like Robin Hood and Arthur, have become so ingrained in the British, how would you even call it? The British identity. A lot of it, surprisingly, even in what is strictly the English culture, a lot of it does actually spring from Welsh. And it's honestly quite surprising, because you go through those kinds of stories, and we have the exposure to it, and we don't even question where it comes from for so long. We don't even question where legends like Robin Hood or King Arthur came from, but there is a source, sort of. It's a little complicated with Welsh, but we'll have to ask Haliborn if she comes across the Mabinogion in her studies.
Yeah, we could do it today in the Instagram chat, because I think she's not falling asleep yet, so we can still message her right now, because she's still in Cambridge, so she has time to research about how she can find something like that.
Poor thing. Well, we'll have to message her, and we'll find out what she has to say about those things. I'm so excited to find out.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. This was very amazing. And I cannot wait for our future three-ways with Haliborn about research, because I think that's going to be a very incredibly great resource for so many of our listeners.
Oh, absolutely. I can agree with you more.
Right. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.